Dr. Parker arrived in Muncie aboard one of our flashy new purple Allegheny airliners yesterday afternoon from Columbia, Missouri. I'm not going to take time to enumerate all his achievements, but I would like to say that he is a Texan. He was born and educated in Texas, earning his first 2 degrees at the University of Texas. He later earned his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago, where he served as a research assistant in the Graduate Library School. He also has held top administrative positions in the libraries of Pomona College, the University of Texas, the University of Georgia, and the University of Missouri. Dr. Parker has been very active in the American Library Association, serving on many committees. He has been president of the Missouri Library Association and is the current president of the Missouri Library Commission. His writings include many articles in the library journals and other publications, as well as 2 books: Library Application of Punched Cards, Missouri, Its Resources, People, and Institutions. It is my great honor to act as hostess for Dr. Parker this weekend, and I'd like to present him to you, Dr. Ralph Parker, Dean of the School of Library and Informational Sciences at the University of Missouri, who will speak to us on the subject, Are Computers the Answer? Are they the answer, Dr. Parker?
I selected last summer a title, Are Computers the Answer? I'm not going to tell you right now, except I would like to remind you that 3 or 4 years ago, there was a game going around. It was being played on television, in which a word would be given as the answer. And then the game was to find out what is the question that the word is the answer to. So we can start with, yes, computers are the answer. Computers are the answer. But what are they the answer to? And you won't know until I'm through what the question is. Some 6 months ago, the chancellor of our school called all of the deans together in a special meeting to hear a gentleman from the wide open spaces of West Texas talking about the great developments that were taking place in educational networks. This gentleman, an electrical engineer, went on to describe the college of the future in which there were no buildings. Students sat in their own homes, scattered all over the sand-blown wastes of the Panhandle, watching television screens while professors on videotape lectured them and passed out the information. And they would also have a network so fixed up that it would be possible to get information from some kind of an electronic library in which this could be done in the 10-minute break between class. You have to have a 10-minute break. I don't know why, if you don't have to go from one classroom to another, but they figured that you'd still have a 10-minute break between classes. And how were they going to use their computers and their switching equipment during that time? But this would be used for the high-speed transmission of information for the benefit of the student sitting in his private home. there would be the ability of the student to ask questions. He could see what's going on in the classroom, which didn't exist. He could see the professor, but the professor probably could not see him. But now I haven't been able to describe this with all the enthusiasm and the glamour and the glory with which he did make the description, but he really made it sound something real good. And I'm not sure that any of the other deans there got to worrying about whether they were going to be out of jobs or not. And I sat there not really worrying too much that the library was going to be put out of business. But there are those people today who believe that the computer is the answer to everything. It is the ultimate. And that all it takes to get the information which an individual wants is to press a few keys. Right now, I think the favorite idea is these touch-tone telephones, which we aren't as up-to-date as you are here. We don't have touch-tone telephones in Columbia. And I amused myself a while this morning listening to the musical tones that I could get by playing different numbers. But they're supposed to represent a great medium for access to the information which people will be able to obtain in these educational and informational systems of the future. These pictures of the death of the book and the death of the library come mostly from two rather prestigious occupations, professions, which have only recently discovered information, in quotes. There are those people who have, since the day of the computer, become aware of things of which librarians have been conscious for some 5,000 years. But, and I hope that it's safe, I don't see an exit down this direction, but particularly the medical profession and electrical engineers have, within the past decade, discovered that there is such a thing as a printed word, and that it carries information, and and they also have discovered the computer, and they have done most of the blue sky talk about how the day of the library is past. We're in a period of information explosion, and there is a crisis in libraries, and that librarians do not have the slightest idea of what to do. Unfortunately, both of these professions are at the moment very prestigious ones. People listen to engineers because they are getting us to the moon, and people listen to doctors because we are living in an age in which physical well-being is far more important than intellectual and moral well-being, and so we bow down and glorify the doctor. Now, see, this is a rather dangerous thing to say because I have some MDs in my own family, and as a matter of fact, I have an MD on my own faculty in library school, and I don't know what he would say, and we're about to hire an electrical engineer, and I don't know what they would say if they were to hear me out talking like this. But you do have a rather enthusiastic group of people who have gotten onto an idea and have run with it very fast and very far, much faster and much further than reality justifies. I'm talking like a reactionary, I presume. I guess I'm getting to be a reactionary. For some reason or other, I seem to be casting myself in that role, although it was 34 years ago that I first started using data processing equipment in libraries. And for the first 25 years of that 34-year period, I was one of the few people who were interested in that, and I was considered a far-out nut. But since 1960, there are a lot of other nuts that have taken the ball and have run, you see, a lot further, and so maybe I'm not just getting old and old fogey, and I don't want to run any further than I had run by 1960. But there is a vast promise and a great potential for computers in the information transfer process. Despite the disparaging remarks I have made to the present. But we must look at the future with, let us use the term, cautious optimism. First, let us recognize that there are two basic aspects of access to information which may be needed by individuals. First is bibliographic access. We need to know what publications exist and where those publications exist. What publications contain the information which we need, and where can we find copies of them. This is actually the most difficult part of gaining access to information. The second part, physical access to the documents, is a much simpler process. Once we know where the information is published, finding the copy itself and delivering that to the user to read, assuming that people in the future are going to read, is relatively simple. So that we in libraries are mostly concerned, are basically concerned, with problems of bibliographic access. I remember back in the 1930s, there were two things that were going to solve then that were the answers to all of the questions in libraries. There were two developments. One was microfilm. It was going to solve all of the problems. And if perchance there were any problems not solved by microfilm, it was going to be done by interlibrary loan. Now, what has happened? To what extent has microfilm replaced books, the codex books in libraries today? Very little. There are more books in libraries by far now than there were in 1930. And microfilm, although it has made great gains, is in addition to and not in place of the books which you find in the libraries. And in general, I would just venture a guess that far less than 10% of the content of most libraries is in microform. There may be some individual libraries in which that is not true, but it still represents a rather small proportion of the total resource. Interlibrary loan, we were going to really solve the problems, but once interlibrary loan got really to working, we decided that it wouldn't work after all. And back about 1960, all of the large libraries began refusing to lend issues of periodicals. That's where you need the interlibrary loan most. That's where we have our best bibliographic access through union lists and through the periodical indexes. And here we were getting to a point where we could get at the material on a nationwide or international basis, and libraries said, we will no longer lend our bound periodicals. Fortunately, Xerox came along at about that time, and I hesitate to even estimate the millions of pages of books that are copied each year, either books or periodicals, that are copied each year for interlibrary loan, in lieu of interlibrary loan among libraries. Even so, our bibliographic access is still not as good as it could be, and our interlibrary cooperation in form of interlibrary loans is far from as good as it could be. The computer gives us an opportunity to make improvements in this area and to enter into a new concept of interlibrary cooperation, which has been impossible in the past. Until the present, libraries could cooperate largely because no two libraries were exactly alike, so that the contents of one supplemented and complemented the contents of another. So that cooperation, anytime you get a talk between librarians of interlibrary cooperation, the discussion almost inevitably turned to the sharing of resources. That material which I have, I will lend to you if you don't have it. This works within limits, as I indicated, but is not a cure-all because of certain problems on the sharing the more heavily used materials. This sharing of little used materials is fine, as long as I only want to borrow from you that which you have by accident and don't really care about, then you don't mind lending it to me. But if what I want to borrow is what you have on reserve for a class in your own institution, I'm not going to get it. If the sharing of resources then is limited only to the little used materials, it will work. That is, the infrequently used materials. This resource sharing will work, provided we can find out what the other libraries own within a short period of time and inexpensively. See, it's quite a job to find out what, outside of periodicals, what library owns a particular book, once you've even found what the book you want. But to know who owns it requires a great deal of work. We have relied upon union catalogs of one kind or another, which are extremely expensive, where we record every book owned by every participating library, when what we are really concerned with is the books out at the fringes that are owned by only one or two libraries. But we've got to record all of them in order to know those that are only infrequently held. Now, the computer is going to make it possible in time, and I shall discuss this in a moment, the mechanics of it. It's going to make it possible for us to develop union catalogs in which it will be possible to find out who owns what book, and not too expensively, in relatively inexpensive methods of so doing. But there is another aspect of cooperation which we have not been able to take advantage of, which the computer is going to be of great value, in which the computer is going to be of great value to us. And this is in the area of centralized processing. If we take 5 universities of about the same size and of pretty much the same kind of curriculum, we will find that on the average, each book, each title that is held in those libraries jointly is held about 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 times. This means that each of those books is cataloged twice or 3 times on the average, between 2 and 3 times on the average, and everybody is paying the cost of processing. Now, if we could develop a scheme by which once a library in a network had cataloged a book, that cataloging is immediately and with essentially no cost available to every other library, then we can truly cooperate and gain economic advantage from the likeness of our collections and not just from the dissimilarities of our collections. Let me describe what I think is going to evolve within the next 10 years as a pattern for the use of computers. It is based upon the work done at the Library of Congress on the development of the Mark II bibliographic record format. This is essential if hundreds and thousands of libraries are to communicate with each other, or their computers are to communicate with each other. The records must be explicitly laid out so that there is absolutely no question as to what the record shows. See, when we get into a computer record, let's just visualize a printed Library of Congress catalog card. Now, there is a great deal of information on there that's explicit. It is spelled out in black and white. But there is also a good deal of information which is implicit. It is not stated specifically in the text. For example, the language of the publication is not stated. You can deduce the language in most cases from a knowledge of the language and from looking at the card. You can deduce that the author is a personal author and that he has a single last name, or that there is a joint authorship, and that the second author is an Englishman with a double last name, or a Spaniard, or something else. Now, why is this single and double name business? Why is this significant? Well, in a computer, the computer doesn't know. Just a character is a character so far as the computer is concerned. And it doesn't know the difference between a first name and a last name. And if you are scanning records, it is essential that the record itself will tag a part of it and say, this is the author's last name, and it's a double name. This is something which is rather difficult for people who have not worked with computers to appreciate, the necessity for making all information absolutely explicit. The Library of Congress Mark II record is designed for that purpose and was an essential first step. With this, it becomes possible for one library to communicate with another library, to compare editions, to be sure that this book is the same as that book. Now, given the Mark II record, which is nothing in the world but a little building block, that's all it is. It doesn't represent anything except a building block. But given that building block, I conceive that within the next 10 years there will be networks, maybe not a completely integrated national network, but that there will be regional networks, computer-based, which there will be a center with an enormous computer, and it will have stored in magnetic form the catalog of all of the libraries which are in that regional, which are participants in that regional network. Each library will be connected to the center, to the central computer, via terminals which might be in the form of you see these things, they often call them consoles. It's a typewriter that doesn't type, but it has a television screen in front of it, so that the input is, if you're asking questions, you type the question out, and the question will appear on the screen, and the answer will appear on the screen when it comes from the computer. So that each library might have one or more of these, they're called cathode ray tube terminals. It's just a television screen, in which the response from the computer center can be made. On these CRT terminals, the full screen of information can be assembled in, let's just say 1 second. So it's a very fast communication device so far as communication with a human being is concerned. It's not fast in relationship of communication between computers. Now, let's assume, I always use Stevens College, which is another one of the colleges in Columbia, Missouri, as my example on this, because Stevens College is a pretty good-sized college. It's not a big university. They have a couple thousand students. They have a library of 100,000 volumes. And so it's neither a very large library nor a very small library. And I try to picture a scheme by which, let us say that there is a Missouri network, and we'll stick in Missouri since I know those institutions. You can translate them into Indiana if you so wish. There is a network, and we're going to be egotistical enough to say that the center of that is going to be at the University of Missouri, and that's where the big computer is going to be. And Stevens is across town, but that's immaterial. It might be across state. And in the Stevens acquisition department, they won't need a technical processing department at all in this kind of a setup. The acquisition department would consist of one girl there'd be a book selection. People who do book selection, that would go right on. But this acquisition department would have a CRT terminal, and then might well have another little device sitting beside it. This doesn't exist right now, but we can imagine it. A little printing device that is somewhere about halfway between the speed of a typewriter and the speed of a computer printer. A computer printer will run 600 lines a minute to 1,100 lines a minute. A typewriter will do 100 words a minute. So something that would print, let's say 30 or 40 lines in a minute, would be sitting there. So the girl would sit there and would type. She would have a document in front of her that represented a book order. And let's assume that they knew the LC card number. Could be anything else, but let's just assume this one to make it real simple. In this computer, all of the information about who owns the what would all be accessible to all members. Who has this and who has that. But Stevens College would probably have stored in this central computer its own programs, its own dealers, its own account numbers, its own accounts, and so on. It's nobody else's business. It's not the business of Christian College, which is also there in Columbia, to know from whom Stevens College buys its books, or how much it pays, or whether it's overdrawn in its English account or not. Now it's possible to have certain parts of the computer memory under security so that only those who have need for it can gain access to it. So the girl will first sit down and type out the necessary codes to gain access to the Stevens College security information. She will then type the LC card number, and by the time she has, she would probably also type the dealer code that they wish to order it from and the account number they wish to charge it to. And by the time she'd gotten this done, there would appear on the screen in front of her the full bibliographic information from the central catalog, giving the author, the title, the full description of all of it. She could then check and see, yes, this is what we wanted. There was no typographical error. Then she simply hits a key, print, and using the correct programs, the computer will have selected from that record those things which Stevens wants to include in the purchase order, and over on this little printing device sitting over here, it would start typing a purchase order. Meanwhile, back in the center, the record would now show, if anyone else was inquiring about it, that Stevens College has this book on order. That would be available to everybody. When the book arrives, Stevens would have to let them know that it's arrived by some device or other, which there are many, many ways of that. But if Stevens wanted no catalog other than this central type of computer catalog, the cataloging would have been done. But Stevens might wish to have a book form catalog printed out of recent acquisitions, or a catalog of all books acquired in the last 10 years, or all the books in the humanities, or any kind of an index that it might wish, and the computer center would prepare those records for Stevens College. Now, actually, they might be real old-fashioned and say, we want a complete set of catalog cards to file in our own catalog. I doubt that once this kind of a situation gets going, that the card catalog will continue to exist. It's rather hard to conceive of getting rid of it, since after all, I guess the card catalog is the one single most potent symbol of American librarianship that exists. And we're going to be throwing it away. But now let's look at another thing. Let us suppose that Stevens is a member of an organization that's called the Mid-Missouri Association of Colleges. There are 4 other colleges that are members of this same association. And let's suppose that they have developed an cooperative acquisition program. Now, one of the problems with cooperative acquisition programs in the past has been that it is generally cheaper to go ahead and buy the book than it is to find out whether the cooperating member that's supposed to buy it is actually, in fact, going to buy it or not, and when. So that most cooperative arrangements, cooperative acquisition arrangements of anything really significant have fallen by the wayside. But now William Woods College, which is over in Fulton, 27 miles away, is interested in acquiring this same book, and the girl who's handling the operation at William Woods sits down and she types out this number, or the author, or anything else. It doesn't make any difference, any kind of access the way you want to go at it. And she discovers that this is already owned by Stevens College. Not only does she have immediately the information that's owned by Stevens College, but she has the call number at Stevens College. So she can simply write on this book order form that this is at Stevens, and it can be sent back to the professor who requested it. Now, whether he's going to accept that as an answer is something else again, but this is, at least we have a mechanism by which libraries can cooperate on the basis of similarities and not on the basis of differences only. Everything that I said earlier about being able to borrow on interlibrary loan and so on would still apply, because you would be building this union catalog. It wouldn't be a union catalog, it would just be a common catalog. Everybody would have one catalog, and it would all be a computer-based catalog. Now, I think that something like this will evolve within the next decade. There are already some beginnings. Within the next 15 years, there will probably be a national network, so that you will have the regional networks will be hooked together by into a national network. Now let's look at how an interlibrary loan would work, which is quite similar, but you ask a slightly different question about the book. As long as we're going to buy the book, it doesn't make a difference. All we want is the description of it, so we can we know that it's been cataloged, that we have the identification of the book for purchasing purposes, and so on. But if we want to borrow it, we need to know, where is it? There would appear, of course, on the screen the locations, the description of the book, and all of the locations. All it has to do to borrow it then is for the girl to type that they want to borrow this from Stevens, William Wood, University of Missouri, or what have you. Now, once the national network is developed, I can conceive of an automatic switching from the regional computer center to a national center in case the question doesn't get answered in the regional center. If you're looking for something and it's not in the regional center, it would automatically switch to the national center. The national center would probably not have the individual holdings of individual libraries, but would simply indicate what regional centers had the record. So that, let us say that the book that we want is not in the Missouri Center, it would switch to the National Center, and the national computer, the one in the National Center, would then switch the message to the nearest one, which might be Illinois. And the nearest to us, might be Illinois one. And the Illinois Center would show that this book is held at the University of Illinois Library, University of Chicago, and so on and so on and so on. Then we take our pick as to which of the libraries in Illinois we wish to borrow from. Now, this is kind of blue sky itself, but all we are talking about is bibliographic access. I do not believe that within the next 10 or 15 or 20 years we're going to find the contents of books and articles, the information itself, stored in computer form because of the matter of cost. Let's look at some matters of cost just for a very brief moment. A book, a pretty good sized book, will have 250,000 words in it, which would represent about 1.25 million characters. Every space has to be counted also. And when you get down in terms of representation of this, in computer terminology, you have 8 bits per character, and so this would mean about 1 1.25 million times 8 is 100 million bits of information in a normal book. Now, the book costs us, we'll say, $10. We store it in a library, and the storage cost is around 50 cents per year per volume. This pays for building the building, for amortizing the cost of the building, for keeping it clean, not for borrowing the book at all, but around 50 cents per volume per year. A computer central processing unit, the internal core memory of a computer, costs in the neighborhood of 25 cents per bit per month for storage. And a bit is 1/8 of a letter. Now you can get at this. The access depends on the computer, we will say in terms of less than 1/1000th of a second. But we're paying a pretty high price for getting at something in 1/1000th of a second, aren't we? As compared to the cost of access to the book. Now, we can store materials on magnetic disks. You could store the book on magnetic disk. A book of the size that I described might be stored on a single magnetic disk, which costs $400 for the disk itself, and it occupies a space about 3 or 4 times the size of the book. It's 14 inches in diameter by about 4 inches high. It gives access in about 1/4 of a second to any bit of information which you want from it. We could also store that book on a magnetic tape. Now, I'm rounding off a lot of figures here, and that magnetic tape will also store the book. It'll probably store more than a book, but a magnetic tape costs about $40. And you can gain access to the record, to any item on that disc, on that tape, in a period of time up to 5 minutes. It depends upon whether what you want is at the near end of the reel or the far end of the reel. It's just a matter of rolling the tape and seeing and how fast it can be rolled through the computer and read. Oh yes, and while we're doing this, we're having to pay for this computer time on both the disc and the tape. Our book has no machine cost to it. So you see, there is a great range in the cost of storage between the storage of material in codex printed form and in magnetic digital form. Of course, you can store things more compactly and somewhat cheaper, as far as storage is concerned, by putting them in microform, microfilm, microcard, or microprint. But again, there you have a machine. You are tied to a machine to use it. So all in all, I think we can say that the printed book is the most efficient data storage and retrieval system, everything considered, from the point of view of universality of use, that's ever been invented. For certain specific situations, other things are better. But as a general storage and retrieval device, the book is still and will continue to be the most effective device that we have. Now, for the foreseeable future, then, it seems to me that we're going to have the development of computers and computer-based indexing. See, the indexing and finding the specific thing in the book is not the fastest in the world. But finding where it's stored in the book. Once you know what page it's on, you can find it pretty fast, you see. But to be able to know where it is in the book and what book it's in, so that this indexing or bibliographic access phase of our work is going to be put onto computers, and that will move rather rapidly. I have been saying for 5 years that it would occur within 10 to 15 years. The little model that I described to you a moment ago, someone asked me the other day, they said, "You said that 5 years ago, isn't time moving forward?" I said, "Well, there's a good deal of slippage on this." And though there are a number of activities going right now, some of which you may be familiar with, the Ohio College Library Association in Columbus, of which Fred Kilgore is the director, is working in the direction of building such a network for the colleges in Ohio. There is some work being done in the libraries around Pittsburgh. The New England State University libraries are interested. I'm not sure that anything very concrete has come out of their efforts so far. And we are right now involved in something, or about to get involved in something. I have an academic vice president who is an MD who thinks that the little black box is the answer to everything. And he tells me that he is making a grant for next year, I heard a story the other day about the famous psychiatrist who died and went to heaven, and when he got there, St. Peter stopped him and said, "Boy, are we glad you're here. We've got a problem." And the fellow says, "Well, what is it? Who's the patient?" He says, "It's God. He thinks he's an MD." And this academic vice president tells me he is making a grant to our school to develop a network that, such as I have described, for the University of Missouri to begin with, but by next fall I'll be in it up to my ears. So I don't know what the question is. The computer is the answer, but I don't know what is it the answer to. Is it going to replace libraries? Is it going to replace librarians? I don't know what the question is. Thank you.